Hello all, welcome. If you are getting anything out of this, if you are liking it, if you're finding it productive for exam prep, please like, subscribe, hit notifications. Episode 6 brings us to part 5, Nap, chapter 13. I've placed here as a precursor a key quote from this section. I am a cloud congealed around a central object. Please don't zoom in and obsess on this one key quotation. I find it's one of those things that students latch onto and potentially overuse. But Atwood's metaphor here for Offred's feelings works on several levels. On the one hand, she feels like a cloud, something that one can't place one's finger on, something intangible. The Gileadian regime sees straight through her and doesn't value her for anything other than her womb. The rest of her body is congealed, carrying connotations of stagnation, and we will look at that shortly. Hello all. So I was going to have a look at reading all of chapter 13 with you. It might seem like an odd choice because it's actually about that kind of measuring of a passage of passive empty time. I don't think we've really got time to go through all of it, but I want to just caveat some of the things I've said earlier about the need for close analysis or not. At advanced level, you are very much for assessment objective 1 being awarded on your argument. How much are you selecting the relevant material? Yes, objective 2 requires you to look at close analysis of how language shapes meaning. But within that, you're being given a theme in your question, and probably Objective 4, the links between the two texts, because most of the exam boards require a comparative of two novels, two pieces of prose, one pre-1900, the other 20th century. Those AO4 links and the theme of the question will be the driving force behind your argument. But there's a lot in this novel that thematically lets you look at really close analysis of subtle, nuanced differences between meanings of language, the time before versus the prescriptive society of Gilead. And within that, the way that she uses that therapeutically, whereby little things become really rich in thematic symbolism. So, I've got my Handmaid's cup of tea here. Not literally, it just happens to be red. So let's settle in and have something of a read. At the beginning of chapter 13, we have Offred talking about there being time to spare. It's one of the things that she's not prepared for, the unfilled time. She talks about wanting a cigarette. She remembers walking in art galleries and looking at 19th century paintings of harems, groups of wives for a leader, fat women lolling on divans, turbans on their heads or velvet caps, fanned with peacock tails, a eunuch in the background standing guard. There's a lot of symbolism here. The idea of the harem having a group of wives, a very patriarchal setup. The idea of having a guard, a male guard, but to guard against the possibility of the guard having any sexual advances on one's wife, there being a eunuch, there having been castrated, this symbolism of being sterile or unfertile as a man. The reason that she's dwelling on this idea is that she feels sedentary. She is simply stagnating. She wonders what she might use to entertain herself. She likens herself to pigs in the market exercising with pig balls for muscle tone, something mundane to occupy her time. And in a series of analeptic shifts within this chapter, she, for the sake of having nothing else to do, actually continues to take herself through Aunt Lydia's exercises, the breathing exercises, hold, expel, and she remembers, whilst lying on what would have been yoga mats from the time before perhaps, listening to Les Sylphides, which we will look at this episode. She talks about the lethargy of the amount of time spent in the Rachel and Leah Centre, and she remembers Moira referring to the place as a loony bin. She arrives within this chapter and Offred is remembering the relief of Moira being there. "This is a loony bin," Moira said. "I'm so glad to see you," I said. "Where can we talk?" said Moira. "Washroom." "Watch the clock. End stall. 2:30. This isn't like a clandestine toilet meeting amongst students. They are grown women. But she is the rebel who will look to break the rules. It makes me feel safer that Moira is here. We can go to the washroom if we put our hands up, although there's a limit to how many times a day. They mark it down on a chart. I watch the clock, electric and round, at the front over the green blackboard. 2:30 comes during testifying. Aunt Helena is here, as well as Aunt Lydia, because testifying is special. Aunt Helena is fat. She once headed a Weight Watchers franchise operation in Iowa. She's good at testifying. It's Janine, telling about how she was gang raped at 14 and almost had an abortion. Had an abortion. She told the same story last week. She seemed almost proud of it while she was telling. It may not even be true. At testifying, it's safer to make things up than to say you have nothing to reveal. But since it's Janine, it's probably more or less true. But whose fault was it? Aunt Helena says, holding up one plump finger. Her fault, her fault, her fault, we chant in unison. Who led them on? Aunt Helena beams, pleased with us. She did, she did, she did. Why did God allow such a terrible thing to happen? Teach her a lesson, teach her a lesson, teach her a lesson. Last week, Janine burst into tears. Aunt Helena made her kneel at the front of the classroom, hands behind her back, where we could all see her. Her red face and dripping nose, her dull blonde hair, her eyelashes so light they seemed not there, the lost eyelashes of someone who's been in a fire. Burned eyes. She looked disgusting, weak, squirmy, blotchy, pink, like a newborn mouse. None of us wanted to look like that. Ever. For a moment, even though we knew what was being done to her, we despised her. Cry baby, cry baby. We meant it, which is the bad part. I used to think well of myself. I didn't then. So she is honest enough to talk about indoctrination, mob mentality. It's all well and good looking at historic atrocity and knowing that we would not have been part of it. But through fear? How could one not be controlled? That was last week. This week, Janine doesn't wait for us to jeer at her. It was my fault, she says. It was my own fault. I led them on. I deserved the pain. Very good, Janine, says Aunt Lydia. You're an example. I have to wait until this is over before I put up my hand. Sometimes, if you ask at the wrong moment, they say no. If you really have to go, that can be crucial. Yesterday, Dolores wet the floor. 2 ants hauled her away, a hand under each armpit. She wasn't there for the afternoon walk, but at night, she was back in her usual bed. All night, we could hear her moaning, off and on. What did they do to her? We whispered from bed to bed. I don't know. Not knowing makes it worse. The concept here is that she's probably been beaten somewhere that doesn't affect one's ability to be fertile. Possibly she's suffered something like the bastinado or the flacca on the soles of the feet to be unable to walk. She's been beaten for needing the toilet. I raise my hand. Aunt Lydia nods. I stand up and walk out into the hall as inconspicuously as possible. Outside the washroom, Aunt Elizabeth is standing guard. She nods, signalling I can go in. This washroom used to be for boys. The mirrors have been replaced here too by oblongs of dull grey metal, but the urinals are still there on one wall, white enamel with yellow stains. They look oddly like babies' coffins. I marvel again at the nakedness of men's lives. The showers right out in the open, the body exposed for inspection and comparison, the public display of privates. What is it for? What purposes of reassurance does it serve? The flashing of a badge. Look, everyone, all is in order. I belong here. Why don't women have to prove to one another that they're women? Some form of unbuttoning, some split crotch routine, just as casual. A dog like sniffing. The high school is old. The stalls are wooden, some kind of chipboard. I go into the second one from the end, swing the door to. Of course, there are no longer any locks. In the wood there's a small hull. At the back, next to the wall, about waist height. Souvenir of some previous vandalism or legacy of an ancient voyeur. Everyone in the centre knows about this hole in the woodwork. Everyone except the ants. I'm afraid I'm too late, held up by Janine's testifying. Maybe Moira has been here already. Maybe she's had to go back. They don't give you much time. I look carefully down, a slant under the stall wall, and there are 2 red shoes. But how can I tell who it is? I put my mouth to the wooden hole. Moira, is that you? She says. Yes. Relief goes through me. God, I need a cigarette. Me too. I feel ridiculously happy. So this stagnant time, this stagnation of sedentary time is conveyed here in not necessarily a flashback, but a kind of dwelling on empty time. I sink down into my body as into a swamp, fenland, where only I know the footing. Treacherous ground, my own territory. I become the earth I set my ear against for rumours of the future. Her body is a swamp, something where the water is not running, something where the stagnancy of that water evokes the infertility of the womb, not having a baby. Treacherous ground, danger. Each twinge, each murmur of slight pain, ripples of sloughed off matter, menstruation, the building of the lining of the womb each month, swellings and diminishings of tissue, droolings of flesh. These are signs. These are the things I need to know about. Each month I watch for blood, fearfully, for when it comes, it means failure. I have failed once again to fulfill the expectations of others, which have become my own. I used to think of my body as an instrument of pleasure, a means of transportation to go where I want and do what I wanted, or an implement for the accomplishment of my will. I could use it to run, push buttons of one sort or another, make things happen. There were limits, but my body was nevertheless live, energetic, single, solid, one with me. Now the flesh arranges itself differently. I'm a cloud, something intangible, congealed around a central object, the shape of a pear, which is hard and more real than I am, and glows red with its translucent wrapping. This regime looks straight through her merely for the value of her womb. Inside it is a space, huge as the sky at night, and dark and curved like that, though black-red rather than black. Pinpoints of light swell, sparkle, burst and shrivel within it, countless as stars. Every month there is a moon, gigantic, round, heavy. The moon conveying the menstrual cycle, but here an omen of failure. Luna, the moon, comes from the Greek luna, which translates in the ancient Greek as womb. It transists, pauses, continues on and passes out of sight, and I see despair coming toward me like a famine. Lack of a baby is metaphorically conveyed here with the imagery of a famine. To feel that empty again. I listen to my heart, wave upon wave, salty and red. Menstruation is stuck together here, is what's the word I want? Elided with tears. Menstrual blood, red, salty, tears. Continuing on and on, marking time. She has an analeptic shift at this point back to her former life in her first apartment with Luke. And then from this perfunctory, everyday, mundane memory, she drifts into a dream, a nightmare. I'm running with her, holding her hand, pulling, dragging her through the bracken. She's only half awake because of the pill I gave her so she wouldn't cry or say anything that would give us away. She doesn't know where she is. The ground is uneven. Rocks, dead branches, the smell of damp earth, old leaves. She can't run fast enough. By myself I could run faster. I'm a good runner. Now she's crying. She's frightened. I want to carry her, but she would be too heavy. I have my hiking boots on and I think when we reach the water I'll have to kick them off. It will be too cold. Will she be able to swim that far? What about the current? We weren't expecting this. Quiet, I say to her angrily. I think about her drowning and this thought slows me. Then the shots come behind us. Not loud, not like crackers, but sharp and crisp like a dry branch snapping. Thwap, thwap, thwap. Sounds wrong. Nothing ever sounds the way you think it will, and I hear the voice. Down! Is it a real voice? Or a voice inside my head? Or my voice out loud? I pull her to the ground and roll on top of her to cover her, shield her. Quiet! I say again. My face is wet. Sweat or tears. I feel calm and floating, as if I'm no longer in my body. Close to my eyes there's a leaf. Red. Turned early. I can see every bright vein. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I ease off. I don't want to smother her. Instead, I curl myself around her, keeping my hand over her mouth. There's breath and the knocking of my heart, like pounding at the door of a house at night where you thought you'd be safe. It's all right. I'm here, I say. I whisper, please be quiet. But how can she? She's too young. It's too late. We come apart. My arms are held and the edges go dark and nothing is left but a little window. A very little window, like the wrong end of a telescope. Like the window on a Christmas card. An old one. Night and ice outside with one candle. A shining tree, a family. I can hear the bells. Sleigh bells from the radio, old music. But through this window I can see, small but very clear. I can see her going away from me, through the trees which are already turning, red and yellow, holding out her arms to me, being carried away. The bell wakes me, and then Cora knocking at my door. I sit on the rug, wipe my wet face with my sleeve. Of all the dreams, this is the worst. So, a succinct overview of chapter 13. Offred's inner life and thoughts are her own, despite the outward control of the commander and his wife. There's time to spare, she says. That's one thing I wasn't prepared for. The amount of unfilled time. The long parentheses of nothing with which to stimulate herself. Parentheses, brackets. She feels like most of her existence is so meaningless it could simply be flippantly thrown away. She practices Aunt Lydia's exercises to fill time, going back in her mind to the anarchic behaviour of Moira at the Rachel and Leah Centre. Offred recalls the expectation to testify to their allegedly immoral behaviour of the time before and to repent for it. Of course, in the Christian faith, one might have attitudes about promiscuity, about sexual morals, about not being overly provocative. That can come up in court cases relating to rape. But in this case, we see Janine, who becomes of Warren, indoctrinated or forced into accepting the blame for being the victim of a gang rape. Offred also recalls brutal punishments for lapses in discipline, and in spite of this, Moira goes on to break the rules. Back in the present of the commander and his wife's household, Offred contemplates her body and monthly cycle. She thinks of Luke and dreams of her attempted escape across the border when she ran as fast as possible with her child, heard shots, and never learned whether Luke was hit. She remembers her daughter dragged away and wakes with her face wet with tears. We've previously quoted Lydia referring to the time before as one of anarchy, and we've used several times this term anarchy. Can you define it? A state of disorder due to groups' non-recognition of authority or systems of control. Gilead, by means of coup or civil war, some sort of takeover, has enforced strict totalitarian control. So far, we've only really seen Offred as the outwardly obedient handmaid, who inwardly considers rebellion, but rarely commits, and even then only ever in small acts, for self-preservation's sake. She makes it clear in her inward dialogue that she doesn't trust or agree with Gilead's authorities. What rules does she break, and what are the potential punishments for these lapses in discipline? Take time to consider this, please. Hit pause. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. She considers matters of an erotic nature within this chapter. She questions and challenges the rules of Gilead. She lies to an aunt. She meets with another handmaid. She disrespects the ritual of testifying. She steals and retains butter to act as moisturiser. She tried to escape Gilead. She had an affair with a married man, who later became her husband. She speaks to a handmaid inappropriately. If Offred breaks society's rules and commits crimes, are they a matter of legality, morality, or both? Consider Gilead's parameters versus our own society and culture. Create a Venn diagram. If you haven't got a pair of compasses, draw around a flower pot, draw around a plate, draw around a saucer, or just create a little table, whatever you like. Are her straying across boundaries legal in our world versus Gilead's? Are they simply moral, or do they overlap the both? Early in chapter 13, Offred revisits a similar memory of the Red Centre of listening to Les Sylphides, a ballet, Chopin, I believe, during breathing exercises. It's a ballet that centres around sylphs, a mythological spirit of the air, and the ballet has no plot, no storyline. can you draw any parallels about how that reflects the novel? I've included here a link on YouTube. I'll put it in the comments or the description of the video below. Need to remind myself to remember to do that. For an example of Chopin's Les Sylphides. Skip ahead a bit once it starts and just have a brief listen. How does its tone and timbre make you feel? Is it relaxing? Is it hypnotizing? Does it create this stagnant or sedentary time that she talks of? Is it numbing? Does it reflect the way that the regime indoctrinates? In episode 4 we looked at the representation of Moira and Offred's mother. What other women are represented in this chapter in Offred's flashback, and how are they represented? Moira has resisted arrest. She has a bruise on her cheek. She's politically incorrect. This place is a loony bin. She's a risk taker. Where can we talk? She does not conform. Janine, on the other hand, seems quite sycophantic. Sycophantic is one of my favourite words. You'll become familiar with it if you follow my Othello course once I've constructed it. To be sycophantic is to be excessively servile. You're a yes man. You're bowing and scraping. You're a brown noser. You're a kiss ass. She is emotional. She's perceived as weak. She's squirmy. She conforms to whomever will be the boss. She's going to do as she's told. I led them on. She accepts blame for her being the victim of a former gang rape. The aunts, however, in contrast to this, are dictatorial, authoritative. I raise my hand and Aunt Lydia nods, not just like a teacher, but literally standing guard. They're cruel. Two aunts haul Dolores away to punish her with some form of beating over wetting herself. They're vindictive. Whose fault was the sexual assault? If this is relevant to you, great. If not, you can just sit tight a few seconds before we go into some Handmaid's close analysis. How do these female characters compare if we were to make some assessment objective for comparative or contrasting links to Frankenstein? In Frankenstein, the women are named. That seems like a given in most texts, but in Handmaids, the women are actually or unnamed via the patronymic of and then the commander of the household, signifying them like slaves as being owned by the patriarch. The older Frankenstein novel features relatively autonomous women, unlike the regime that has come to be in the more contemporary Handmaids. The women in both are chiefly passive, but can be active depending on character. Especially in Victor Frankenstein's eyes, they're defined as gifts of celestial beauty by their physical traits. The core and chief physical trait that is the valued thing in Handmaids, quite obsessively, is their fertility. The women of Frankenstein are victims of consequences of males' actions. Perhaps that's not quite so distinct a binary opposition in Handmaids. Both are, to some extent or another, in different ways, stereotyped, or victims of stereotyping. We've had an introductory reading of chapter 13 earlier. How does Offred feel in this sedentary section? How can you tell? Use evidence from the things I've highlighted here. Look at the language. What frequent word types are there in terms of verbs, adjectives, nouns? Don't just label them, but make meaningful use of them. Does Offred use any symbols or metaphors in this thought process? Semantic fields or connotations? Swamps, treacherous ground and territory, staking a claim to my own territory, a murmur of slight pain, ripples, sloughed off matter, swellings and diminishings of tissue, droolings of the flesh, blood, instrument of pleasure, means of transportation, implement for the accomplishment of my will, lithe, solid, flesh arranges itself differently. I'm a cloud congealed around a central object, the shape of a pear, which is hard and more real than I am, and glows red within its translucent wrapping. Black red, light swell, sparkle, burst, shrivel, moon, round, heavy, omen, wave upon wave, salty and red. Write a paragraph or two, perhaps, of close analysis, or make some notes, some planning on how this symbolism conveys connotations about how she's feeling, and we will move on in the next slide to my example of a piece of analysis on this. Offred has described long swathes of empty time in this chapter, simply, merely waiting. Rather than fertility, she uses an antithetical, directly opposite semantic field of stagnation here through the simile of likening her body to a swamp, or at least her womb to a swamp. This image extends beyond stagnation, connoting lack of fertility, to the concept of treacherous ground in which one could lose one's footing and sink. She's constantly on edge. She's feeling betrayed by the treachery of a period, having a period, that brings the news that she's not pregnant. She's stagnant, awaiting a pregnancy that the state dictates, the state of Gilead, dictates she must want, a disturbingly warped form of surrogacy. Just as swamp connotes algae, stagnation, toxicity, her menstruation is described grotesquely as sloughed off matter, a bit like slurry or manure, swellings and diminishings of tissue. The blood conveys a sense of failure that has disturbingly become her own emotional sense of failure, when it's actually others' implications that dictate her fate. She has become obsessed with having a baby for the means of others within this regime. Where once she had the freedom to do her own free will, she's now a cloud congealed around a central object. An outwards metaphor for Offred's feelings here works on several levels. On one, she feels like a cloud, something that is intangible, that one cannot grasp. You can't put your finger on a cloud, it's vapour. Your fingers would go straight through it. The Gileadian regime sees straight through her. She is translucent and doesn't value her for anything other than her womb. Her womb is hard and more real than the rest of her. That's intangible. The rest of her body is congealed, which again has this grotesque, repulsive connotation to it, carrying connotations of stagnation, cooling, becoming semi-solid blobs, the opposite of new life or fertility of Gilead's aims, and, by proxy, aims that have become her own. She conflates, there's the word that I was trying to remember, she conflates menstrual blood and the salt of her tears, mentioning the moon. Every month there is a moon, the moon's cycle of 30 days, like that of the womb, gigantic, round, heavy, an omen foreboding something negative, another failure. I see despair, not being pregnant, coming toward me like a famine, lack of fertility in the soil, lack of produce. Again, this semantic field of produce and consumption, of plague, like God's judgment, the plague of locusts, this plague of a declining birth rate. To feel that empty again, sedentary stagnation, no progress. Omen here connotes the negative fate of being without child and thus sent to the colonies, where she will clean up toxic waste and die of radiation poisoning. The lack of baby is conveyed metaphorically as a famine of no fertility. The etymology of moon, what we in the contemporary time would call lunar, again, if you're unfamiliar with etymology, the history of the origins of the term moon or lunar comes from the ancient Greek luna, without the R, translating as womb, as in 30-day cycle for moon in a contemporary sense. There's actually an inherently patriarchal sexism that, because of this patriarchal regime, I think is relevant here, because that's also where the term lunatic comes from. The stem comes from this term, and in history the people who invented words were more likely to be men, potentially with misogynistic attitudes, looking down on women in a derogatory or dismissive way. Lunatic implying that only a woman can become hysterical or suffer insanity or mental illness, something which was once blamed, a woman's mental illness or depression, on the completely mistaken concept of the displacement of a wandering womb. So don't panic at that depth of analysis. That's just my example that I've come up with for close analysis. You don't need to be thinking that you are desperately in need of emulating exactly that. That is just one example. There are many different ways that you can do it, and a great many roads lead to Rome. Okay, let's get you thinking then, please. This is a novel that has a great many analeptic shifts. It doesn't just do brief flashbacks, it can shift back and forth to the immediate past, the relatively recent past of the regime, or further back to the time before the regime, and back and forth like a mosaic. It's very fragmented, and we as a reader have to piece it together. These things are elements of this chapter. However, rather than simply placing them in the order they occur in the chapter, can you reorder them for me in their actual narrative chronology? I'm going to ask you to hit pause to do that in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Number 1, in the apartment with Luke. Number 2, her escape attempt with her husband and daughter. Number 3, Offred captured by Border Patrol. Number 4, Moira arriving at the Red Centre. Number 5, Janine testifying and Offred secretly meeting Moira. And number 6, Offred waiting in her room for the ceremony, the attempt at impregnation and fertilization, to begin. As ever, if you are comparing with Frankenstein, then here's some AO4 material for you. If you're not, briefly sit tight. Frankenstein's dream in chapter 5 of Frankenstein. After receiving the creature with breathless horror and disgust, he has a dream, Victor. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form. I saw grave worms crawling in the fold of the flannel. He wakes, and he sees his new child, the creature, reaching out for comfort, but mistakes it as a desire to violently detain him, judging by appearance. Can we read this as Victor's horror at playing God and creating life without a female role? Queer critics have cited a fear of intimacy as a possibility. How can we compare this dream with that of Offred? Both are horrifying. Both link to concepts and guilt over paternal or parental or maternal responsibility. I've already read Offred's dream to you earlier at the beginning of the episode, and just to remind you of that, the final page of that chapter, with its frequency of commas, the short clauses, which hopefully was emphasised in the way I read it, the use of italics, conveys the pace and fraught nature of her escape attempt, with her daughter, balancing care for her daughter with the need to be merciless in getting away quickly. What impressions do we gain of her as a mother? Does the use of present tense make us relive the terror, the breathless panic, the anxiety, the pressure? This is the worst of her nightmares, ironically triggered as she's about to be taken away to attempt the creation of a new child. By creating the creature, Victor Frankenstein is transgressing moral boundaries. He equates himself with God. He usurps God's role and plays God, subverting nature. He doesn't breed with a woman. Through his hubris, his excessive pride, he asserts a right preserved for the female of the species. Don't muddle hubris and hamartia here. His hamartia might be his excessive ambition. Hubris always relates to pride. He takes the role here that his wife Elizabeth should have had. And perhaps the vision of Elizabeth transformed into the decomposed remains of his dead mother symbolises that. Both narrators' sentences become abbreviated and abrupt, indicating nerves and paranoia. That's the end of our episode for today, ladies and gents. If you are getting meaningful, useful things out of it, like, subscribe, hit the bell. See you next time.